so much for joining us today, and to everyone who is Zooming in as well. I am Dr. Sarah Kinkel. I am the Partnerships Manager in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Unit at UTS. And we are here today to take a deep dive into the world of smart sensing. And we're going to hear from 3 Sydney-based startups that are using these technologies to have a real impact on people, real businesses, and the cities and spaces that we live in. So I want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I am really anxious to get to our panelists and to get to introduce them, but I also want to give a moment to give just a little bit of brief context about why we're here. So this event is being held as part of the physical launch of UTS's new Res Hub, Research Excellence and Support Hub, which helps our researchers to develop the capabilities and the tools and the connections to make the most out of their research opportunities. This event is also a collaboration, as you can see, with the University of Sydney Knowledge Hub and the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network. And I'd like to ask our colleague, Paul Isman, to please come up and tell us just a little bit about the Sydney Knowledge Hub and the work that you're doing.
Hi, everybody. Hi, wherever I'm Rupal. It's really exciting to hear about Res Hub as well, because the Sydney Knowledge Hub kind of is a similar sort of proposition. We're about 1.5 years old, and we're there to help make researchers get the most out of their research. So we help them connect to the outside world through, industry partnerships, through commercialization, to kind of foster researchers on their pathway to commercialization and so forth. So we operate a co-working space in the heart of campus at UC. And then we run programming and events. So an event like this is really fantastic because it's so easy to work, within such a large university like the University of Sydney. It's so easy to just be insular and focus on kind of the opportunity, the tons of opportunities, but the opportunities that are internal. And so much of what Sydney Knowledge Hub is about connecting people outside of the kind of the ecosystem. So it's so great to be doing this with UTS. Thanks, Sarah, for kind of helping pull this together. Thanks, everyone at UTS. Is anyone here from NSSN? Probably online. Hopefully you're online. So thanks, NSSN. And I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you. And so for those of you who are either physically here at UTS or Zooming in from UTS, if you are interested in pursuing entrepreneurship as part of your own research, the best place to start is UTS Startups, where we help to prepare people from across the UTS community to have impact. And really the best time to start is now, and the best place to start is where you are. So UTS Startups, there you go. So I do want to now introduce our panel, and I'll start immediately to my right. So Sebastian Robertson is married to a legend. He's also the father of 2 beautiful girls. In his spare time, which I'm sure there's a lot of, he is the co-founder and CEO of BIRDI, a VC-backed aerial intelligence technology platform. So BIRDI is on a mission to build the world's most unique aerial data platform to provide drone services and efficient, standardized, scalable data capture and insights. Sebastian is also the founder and chairman of preventative youth mental health charity Batir. Next to Sebastian is Emily Bobis, who is the co-founder of Compass IoT, a multi-award-winning tech startup that utilizes connected vehicles to improve road safety and city planning. She won the University of Sydney's $10,000 Startup Innovation Pitch Prize in 2020 and was recently featured in the Startup.info Innovators versus COVID article series. And then finally, Dr. Thanasis Boulis is a computer engineer with 20 years of experience designing sensor networks, communication protocols, and algorithms. So most of his professional life, he's worked as a researcher, leading smart sensing projects like the structural health monitoring of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He's now the principal systems architect of Bindi Maps, designing the core algorithms for the indoor navigation service that Bindi Maps provides. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today. All right, deep dive into smart sensing. So I would like to start with the big picture, and I'm hoping that each of you will help me give your perspective on that. Why should we care about smart sensing? What's so important about this technology? What's going to look different once we get it right? And what does that look like in the context of your startups?
Sebastian?
Yeah,
I was really hoping you got it far. Oh, look, I think the first disclaimer is I'm not a technical person. So when I came into this space, I was very much looking at solutions, like how is this going to help solve a problem for me? And then kind of from that, it kind of came back to a sensor through drone technology. And so in that context, it started from around sport and about spatial awareness of sport and what lines you're running and how do you tell someone this is the best way. So spatial awareness is one of the hardest things to teach when you're coaching a sport team. And so I got into it because both my brother and I, his co-founder, love sport and kind of said, how can we improve coaching? And we started using drones. And that was kind of the catalyst. We then had a background in energy efficiency, looking at solar panels and then determining that the solar panels being installed on homes weren't that efficient. How could you run thermal imagery over the top of it to get better understanding of the conditions of the panels? And then we started going, God, you could put a thermal camera on a drone, and all of a sudden, then we're looking for metrics. So everything kind of started leading back to this core point of how are we capturing the data to get a better insight to solve a world problem. And that for me was kind of the starting point, was always looking at what problems can we solve? And then the central point for me was around drone technology. And that kind of, I guess, started me off in a journey to smart sensing in a broader concept. So for me, it was very much about trying to identify what problems can we solve. And then the solution was very heavily around smart sensing. I think that's going to be a focus point for us looking forward as a society.
I think on that, you raise a really good point in terms of just the scope that smart sensing encompasses. And I think that's why it's such an important topic, because it's not just one particular industry like transport, which is where my industry lie. It encompasses things that we touch in our everyday life. So for example, my mom just recently bought a Roomba because she has tennis elbow and golf elbow at the same time. And as part of that process of not having to vacuum, she bought one of these vacuums. And she was showing me the other day, she's like, oh my God, look, it's made a map of our house. Like, she's talking about it to everybody, how it's created this cool personal experience for her in like a healing sense. And so I think in terms of more towards Compass and where that fits in the ITS space or the intelligent transport system space, particularly in road safety more recently, normally when you have a trend in road safety, it can take like 2 to 3 years in order to get enough data from different sources to try and figure out where a black spot might be, so that then a government or a local council can go and get funding and implement that funding and save lives. And if you consider on average that 1,000 Australians die on our roads every year, that's 2,000 to 3,000 people who die before any action can actually be taken. So if you're using smart sensors like we do in that space, you can, like, the human cost of that is very tangible. And I think that's when it becomes really, really important.
I agree. It's smart sensing is a huge field, if you will. It's not one thing, and I wouldn't say there's one right thing to do. There's 1,000 right things to do in the future. Imagine a little bit, going back to the 70s, 60s, and somebody asking, what is the next big thing in computing? Whoa, so many different things, right? It's really, really huge. So with smart sensing, the way I see it at least is, and just giving a very, very high, moon high view of the whole idea, is a next step in computing. Right? Computers are good in processing data, and traditionally or historically, we inputted all the data, we had a keyboard and we started typing in things, words, numbers. Eventually had a little bit more, had a single sensor like a microphone in front of us to record the voice. And then someone would hear it, or a camera, and someone would watch it. But imagine if you could hear and listen to everything in the world around you, right? Everything in the world around you. And there's no single person, or not all of us can watch or listen to that. We need computers now to process all these data. And so it's the next thing of how do we input data into our computers, and then how do we make sense of that data? Because that's really the difficult thing, right? We have all this data coming in. How do we make sense of it? And there's so many opportunities, and we've started discussing it many years now. From every field, from agricultural to transportation to buildings to everything, really, health. So to me, it's just we will definitely see much more smart sensing in the future. It will become something as common as computing is today. We will have a computer in our pockets. And I don't know what the next big thing will be. it will be probably many, many different things. And in terms of what Bindi is doing, now coming down for this very, very high, moon high view, we're using wireless technology to know where a person is or a smartphone is in space. So we can navigate them and help them navigate into spaces, particularly for blind people, but for everyone. So it helps from, give some feedback back to the user, where are you? But this also works both ways. You gather a lot of this data, and the building managers know, okay, this is how my people walk in this space. There are some issues, there are some things we're doing right, some things we're doing wrong. So it works both ways, immediate feedback and usefulness for the user to find out the way, and also for the building managers.
I think one of the things that struck me most about your thoughts and perspectives there is just really about the scope of this, and it's everything from, like you say, a Roomba to which is such a household element, to all the data you can imagine from the sky and our streets and beyond, right? And a colleague was asking me this morning, well, what is smart sensing? And I was like, dude, you don't even know, man. It's going to be everything in the future, which was obviously a really technical answer. So
I'm very correct.
yes, also correct. So we're here to celebrate and support research impact and translation. And so Thanasis, I want to start with you on this question, because you've had a really diverse career path. You have a PhD in electrical engineering from UCLA, and in between there and here, you've worked with industry, you've been a startup founder yourself, you now work with Bindi. What has that path looked like for you, and what skills have you adapted or leveraged from your time as a PhD student to get to where you are now?
Well, my first steps after my PhD was into research, so academic research with a touch of industry. So some of the skills were, let's say, a continuation of what I was doing in my PhD in terms of publishing, in terms of doing basic research. But if I'm looking at myself now, what we do in Bindi, which is an interesting startup, we are solving problems that other people have grappled with, other people have different solutions with them, we're providing our own solution. So things that are new. We're solving some new things. So there is research involved, but it's also research that has to be practical and make it work in the same time. In terms of skills, the two things that come to mind have to do more with I guess, emotional skills that developed along the way. So one would be the persistence and curiosity. So when you have a problem in front of you, which is kind of big, and I don't know how to do that, I don't know how to solve that, I have no idea. But you need to attack it. You need to, and you step up, like start, hammering over there, and then maybe over there, and poking over there, and then looking at it on the other side, and keep doing it, even though it seems too hard. And then you get a little break, and then you get another little break, and then rocks up and you say, now we have something. So that's one skill, how to keep on persisting and looking at different angles. And the other major thing, I think, is how do you handle failure? So failure is quite important. And so when you're in school, yes, you can fail, of course, but there is a very set way of, you take courses, you pass them usually, you have very specific failures or not. But when you go to the PhD, when something is much more open, first of all, you will definitely fail. You will definitely fail in bigger or medium ways, but you'll definitely fail. So in order to finish that and go on, you have to know how to manage this failure. And knowing that's not the end of the world, knowing that you will, it's a new start or it's a lesson. It's the same thing with startups, right? You will fail in many different things while doing anything, from technical things to business things to sales things to anything. So I think those two things, how do you handle failure and how do you persist on a problem?
So Sebastian, you sort of hinted at this before, which is that Emily and Sebastian, you don't have technical backgrounds in this, and you can come in and have an impact, again, being a research level, PhD level expert in smart sensing, but there's other ways to approach the problem also. So how do you bring in the expertise that you feel like you need in those technical areas, and how are you working with researchers, for example? Emily, Sebastian, I'm going to skip you this time. We're going to start with Emily, we'll come back.
Being in the middle didn't help me that. I think particularly being a part of like the UTS Startups community, so Compass actively is involved in that, which is such a really great community in terms of getting us in touch with other startups, but also getting us in front of researchers through UTS, including, I think we got some students through their iLab program. And I mean, I tell you what, these students in their computing science and stuff were just like absolute guns. Designed a whole algorithm for us, tested it, and put it through a more rigid methodology than I think we could have without a technical background. I also think there's a role to be played in partnerships with universities. So one of the first people that Compass ever approached was the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies through the University of Sydney. And part of the reason we did that is because we understood that we had a knowledge gap, both in the transport space, but also in the transport data space, and how to apply those two things together. So I think it's very important to have that open line of communication and kind of approaching it from a position of humility as, hey, we don't know everything, and particularly me with no technical background myself, taking in other people's perspectives and their expertise.
Very good. I think there's a mixed bag. One is my mentality is never try to be the smartest person in the room. I have no kind of pride in sitting here being I'm the most technical person getting around. It's just never going to be my skill set. But I do think I'm pretty good at bringing the right people around me to make things come to life. And so part of that challenge is often bridging where you see a problem, working out how you're going to get the right solution. And in Australia, and I think there's places like this and the Sydney Startup place too, there's a real gap between research and commercialization that just has not been done well in terms of the transition across. And it's not one or the other, but I don't actually think just because you're a researcher that makes you a great entrepreneur. I don't think just because you're a great entrepreneur that makes you a good researcher, and vice versa. However, the combination of skill sets will probably is what's required to solve certain problems. So you come at things differently. So from a technical perspective, yes, I'm not technical, but I probably ask the right questions of a technical team to go, right, how do we actually communicate this to a customer? Now, I know that my developers do not want to do my job. They don't want to look for funding. They don't want to find customers. They like coding. They're good at it. And they want a bit of freedom to do what they can do. I can do that. But I need them to do that so I can go do my job. And they need me to do that so they can do their job. And that kind of skill set's really important. The collaboration between universities, there's a few parts, and I'll be specific here. So I'm lucky to have done a lot of startups with my brother. He went to UTS and Sydney University. I went to ANU and have a pretty close relationship with New South Wales. Some of the best grounds for finding good people is in universities. And there's a few different reasons. One, they haven't been taught bad habits by other organizations. So they're kind of green. So you can teach them your way and thinking. So they're kind of a bit more optimistic. They come with flaws. Do not think you're that good if you're a student, firstly. Like you just, and I'm saying this to myself looking back, like you have a specific thing, you need to learn. Practical experience is also the best. But you can find experience by doing stuff with startups and learning from that. So students become an incredible resource that can help amplify startups in different ways that haven't been done before, that it really excites me. So that's why I think there's a lot of value in also on a journey, and we're on a pretty good journey at the moment, is also looking back to bring a community up with you as well. And so making sure you're providing opportunities to other people. So I think there's a responsibility as a founder to provide opportunities for students in different capacities.
I do think, to me, it feels like one of the most common myths about entrepreneurship is that it's something you do all by yourself as this lone wolf. And to me, that seems so shocking because it just feels so obvious. Of course, you'll be strongest when you can build this really strong collaborative team around you and bring in the right people and realize that you don't have to be great at everything. You need to know what you are good at and then help supplement that with the right people at the right time. And I think sort of building off your answer too, you talked a lot about collaboration and about the role of universities and some of the ways that we can still work on getting that better, that translation between research and commercialization. And I think there are places for that. I think hopefully Res Hub will help people move in that direction, City Knowledge Hub and the New South Wales
Yep,
Smart Sensing
exactly.
Network. Shockingly, all the people in the room. I do think there's still opportunities out there. And Emily, I actually really want to talk to you about this because I think something researchers and entrepreneurs both can commiserate on is funding. Where is it? How can you get it? And Compass IoT has been really successful at this. Really, you guys have a laundry list of successes to your name: Incubate, Genesis, New South Wales MVP grant, semi-finalists at the UTS Startups Awards. Tell us a little bit about that part of the journey for you. You know, what have been the most important support networks for you? And what advice would you have for other entrepreneurs who are maybe earlier in the journey about trying to suss out similar funding sources?
In terms of support networks, I definitely think, again, just the university programs that we went through had aspects to them where we were put in front of people that we otherwise would not have been put in front of. Or even just being in a startup community, you're put in front with other startups. And when you're first beginning, you kind of almost don't know that all these other startups exist. And you do get that lone wolf syndrome. And as soon as you get put into this community, you're just like, oh my God, there's more people like me that are kind of crazy enough to do this. And it kind of gives you a sense of like emboldened hope that there is some kind of like light at the end of the tunnel. And I think in terms of advice, it's definitely persistence. And going back to what you said earlier about you're almost like chipping away at something. I think one of the most important lessons is consistency and turning up when you say you will. That I think is half the battle, particularly when you have so much freedom in a startup that you can do what you want, but that's also, oh God, you can do what you want. And if you don't do anything, then that's your fault just as much as building the company is in the first place. I feel like definitely take advantage of your university alumni connections, take advantage of the people in your own personal network connections. I think it's about relationships. So building those relationships with different people across all of those different areas is super, super important.
I want to pivot here just a little bit and talk about, because there's startups and there's all kinds of businesses and there's all kinds of ways to have impact. So Sebastian, BIRDI is not your first rodeo as a founder. You were previously a founder of Batir, which is a for-purpose organization designed to support youth mental health. So what's that been like as your second time as a founder, and how different does it feel being in sort of an explicitly for-profit versus for-purpose space? Is it different? Is it not? How do you balance them?
Definitely different. And I always find it funny. I still don't see myself as a founder. So, and I don't see myself as an entrepreneur. I studied business economics. I worked for GE in a big corporate. I stumbled upon Batir because I have a lived experience of mental health when I was at university. And I always look back and say, what would have changed my journey? And I just wish I heard from a young person talk about how they got through their mental health problems. And so from that, and talking about where they got help, how do you have conversations with family, friends, and how do you access professional networks? And I said, oh, well, I've got a story. Why don't I share my story? And I was like, well, I'm one story, but there are thousands of stories. Why don't we design a program to train other young people? And that was the concept. And then I went into the mental health space, which also shows education. Now, there are two sectors that are pretty territorial around health and well-being, and education's like a fortress. Getting into schools is incredibly difficult, and mental health, you know, you have to prove you do no harm, which is fundamentally the right starting point. But it takes a while to get credibility when you're coming in it from a finance perspective. So, you know, there's an element of the social side of Batir. To some degree, I found harder because there's an emotional connection to the cause of the job. Whereas at BIRDI, I can be more transactional and purely look at it. I've got to solve a problem for a customer. If that's not a real problem that they're willing to pay for, then you know what, pivot the product or adjust it or change the language or do whatever. In terms of finding funding, I find it a lot easier to ask people to give to BIRDI because they're getting a potential decent commercial return at the back end of it. On the social side, you're emotionally connected to, you know, we lose nearly 8 to 9 individual Australians a day to suicide, and nearly 180 attempt to take their life every day. That's not including the kind of COVID statistics. And this is not improving. It hasn't improved for nearly decades, really, like in a holistic sense. So there's an element of the social cause that you're trying to fight for, but then the funding doesn't necessarily align to what you're delivering either. And so there's a real disconnect sometimes in the social entrepreneurship space. One of my biggest observations, the difference between social entrepreneurship and traditional entrepreneurship, and I think there's in a good way, that divide's getting closer. I think businesses are starting to sit in this grey area, which I think is a really good thing, that you can be a good business with a social conscience and you can be a not-for-profit that's commercially sustainable. I think the divide's a really bad thing. But I think the next generation coming through is changing that. But one of the big things that I've seen is the impact it has on the individual founder's mental health as well. And in social entrepreneurship, it takes a bigger toll than it does in commercial entrepreneurship space. I'm not 100% sure why, but there's a lot more emotionally attached to starting a social cause than starting a commercial enterprise. That's been my personal observation. It might not be research back, but that's been my observation. So I think there's elements of, I learned from both, and I think if anything, the benefit of doing a not-for-profits first is like, I'm grounded in that sense of community and that purpose, and how do you take a platform and leverage that in good ways, and looking about how do we lean back into the communities that we operate in as BIRDI. The disadvantage to starting a successful charity first is I have nothing in my bank account. So you kind of weigh it up that most people do something and make a fair bit of money and then go back into philanthropy. I probably did it the other way around. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but it is what it is. So, yeah.
That's an interesting observation about the toll it takes on founders in these different contexts. And I wonder if, coming back to your point about failure and how it is a part of the PhD journey at some level, and it's part of the startup journey, I wonder if it's just actually harder to fail about something that you feel like is so explicitly about people's well-being. How does Bindi Maps think about that? Because you guys are also sort of straddling that divide. You are thinking about people's well-being, and also, it's a business.
That's right. So in terms of impact, I guess there's all sorts of different impacts you can have. And I think every startup starts with something that is impactful, or at least in the vision is do something that will impact people's lives. There's some that do more, the social good thing. Others can be more practical, but they all want, aspire to be to have an impact. With us, it started as it was inspiration from a founder, Anna Wright, about helping blind and visually impaired people. And that vision is clear, I think. But then the business side of it is, all the other complexities. Then it's okay, how do we do that then? So you can have the passion to keep you motivated and push you. But the business is a business. How do we find funding? What is the right way to find funding? Sometimes you have the more noble, causes, as Sebastian was saying, and it's very hard to find funding because how the different players are there. So you have to think of the business problem. What is funding? Is it do I create my own cash flow? So I don't know the full history of Bindi Maps. Anna probably would have said more here about the struggles of finding funding, and but I think the two are, so there's a vision that gives you some motivation, but then how do you deal with it as a business is a separate problem, separate considerations.
Can I add this just to that? There's an element that, and I know this panel's on smart sensing, so I just want to kind of bring it back a bit to that, because there's an element of, if you're not solving a problem, what do you do? And so in this context, like I look at BIRDI, and we're a platform, drone agnostic. We've got 2,000 operators across Australia. I'm constantly looking at how do you leverage off that network. One of the big things I drive in the back of my head is how do we amplify search and rescue, across the world, but how do we amplify it? We have a network of 2,000 operators. When someone goes wrong, and there's great examples of this up in Northern Beaches, and old lady went missing in the sand dunes. The police were there, the ambulance was there. They literally could not find her. They found a local drone operator who happened to be flying above the waters, went and asked him, can you fly above this scrubland for us? Flew it, within 2 minutes, identified the individual, and then when they were able to fly. This was completely by chance that person was there with this sense they could do it. And my push is always like, why don't we automate it? Like in terms of search and rescue, whenever there's an issue, as soon as it's cloud coverage or there's fires, you can't fly at night because it's dark. So it's too risky for the operator to fly it. But you could fly a drone, coordinate it, pre-program it, and get it going. But we don't yet have the structures to enable these to happen. So I think there's an element with this smart sensing component that I think we're kind of focusing a bit on is we're not talking about the technical components around smart sensing yet, because that's not quite relevant to getting people to understand what are the problems that you're trying to solve. And so in that context, it's kind of like we almost stopped speaking about drone technology, to be honest, because to our customer, it doesn't necessarily matter. It's just the platform of which we're capturing the data to give them a volumetric report on how much soil they have in that pile of aggregates on the ground. That's what they care about. That's CSV that they can do an annual audit on. The fact that we capture via drones, which gives them better resolution, which is a faster response time, which is nearly, it saves them about 30, 40, 50% of the cost. There's battery powered rather than aviation fuel, which was manned aircraft. Like that's kind of secondary to it. So I think it's just important that in the smart sensing world, there's a lot of communities that I'm seeing that are focusing on the technology component and trying to work out how that works. And you lose bringing the peripheral with you on it. So the community doesn't understand what is drones doing. They just see drones, it's changing, it's shifting, but they see it as a negative thing, that they're going to invade privacy, that there's huge risks that come with it. They don't see or hear of the problems that they're solving. They hear of the problems of the technology itself. So, sorry, jumping in, but to kind of build on that, that's why I think businesses and entrepreneurs specifically should really focus on what the problem is, and then you're kind of applying a smart sensor in some way.
So I want to make sure, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that it's something that, again, gets honed a bit in research training as well. The idea that there's always 10 people in the world who care about what you're actually researching. But beyond those 10 people, you really need to zoom out and give them an answer to so what? You know, drones, so what? Well, so we are solving all these real problems, right? Again, transport sensing, so what? And as you said, we have the potential to make our streets literally safer. And that's the so what there, right? So I am now going to do the thing that I think Thanasis sort of asked me not to do at the beginning, which is I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions here. And so I want to wrap this part of the conversation up here, but I want to get us amped up about the future. I want to go out on a high. So I do want you to tell me what's the next, on this point of problems, right? What's the next big problem that we're on the cusp of solving here? What does that future look like? And also for the people here in the room or the people who are watching on Zoom, for their futures too, what advice would you have for people wanting to start their careers in sort of smart sensing entrepreneurship, whether researcher, whether already in the startup world, and whether as a founder themselves or people want to come work for you? Get me amped up about the future. And I'm going to start on your end.
Sure.
Sounds fun.
I'll start with the advice. If
Yeah.
you're someone who's looking to be involved, what's to be worried about, what to do. If you are inspired by something, you something, that looks cool, just go into it. Just go into it. There's so much scope, as we said before, and to innovate, just go into it. If you are a technical person, find about different technologies. If you are someone who does business, again, find out about what other people are doing to get inspired. The interesting bit here is that what we're all, building, we're building systems that solve some problems, right? And these systems are relying on some smart sensing. The interesting bit here is that this sensing technology is changing very rapidly, right? And things that weren't possible 5 years ago or 10 years ago now become possible. And it's almost like, you snap your fingers and, oh, now this can happen, right? If we go back and we see what each of us do, if we go back 10 years, most possibly, we couldn't do what each of our companies are doing 10 years ago. It required, this, and then all of a sudden, we can have this new idea. We can build it. Now the system becomes feasible, becomes economically sustainable, right? So, because there's so much scope, just go into it. Let's go into it, see, learn new technologies, tinker with things if you are a technologist, be exposed to new ideas if you are a business person. There's so much scope. in terms of the next big thing, I really don't have one next big thing. With one thing which is closer to my heart is smart buildings. So there's this movement about making the buildings smarter, either by retrofitting them with technologies that, as we do, Bindi is doing, but also the way you're building buildings now from scratch. You're embedding sensors in them, from optical fibers in them to all kinds of sensors in every room. And actually many sensors, though, even though if some of them fail, doesn't matter because you have so many of them, you can still get interesting information. So I see smart buildings as a definitely big thing. It will grow up in the future, but there's so much scope.
What do you think?
I think echoing exactly what you said at the beginning with the advice, when in doubt, do something. So it's better that you kind of do something and see how you go and just kind of have a bit of a play around with it than do nothing at all. I mean, corporate is going to be there when you come back. If nothing doesn't work, corporate's going to be around for the next, forever. In terms of trends, I would say one of the most kind of cool and exciting ones coming up is road infrastructure, which I know people are probably the same. Roads aren't that fun. Yeah, but in terms of what we see with autonomous vehicles, a lot of the time what's been happening is people have been trying to take these autonomous vehicles, and it's like fitting a square peg in a triangle hole and trying to put that vehicle on a road that was built for human drivers. And what we're seeing now is a shift with the help of smart sensors, so that we're actually now being like, hang on, maybe we should have done this the other way. And we're changing the infrastructure that we're putting the cars on so that it's better adapt to that technology. And exactly what you said about technology not existing 5-6 years ago. There was a report by WA Main Roads released in 2015 that said, oh, we'd love to use intelligent transport systems and 5G, but it doesn't exist and we can't use it in transport. And here we are 6 years later, using exactly what they said didn't exist in the context that they wanted to use it in.
I build on it to some degree, and obviously I'm skewed. I'm pretty heavily invested in one field in particular, so I'm just going to double down on that one. And I'll talk about a quick pivot that we did because it was limiting the company. So we kind of pitched ourselves as a drone management company. That's kind of what we went to market with. We set it up just under 4 years ago. We were somewhat ahead of the commercial trend into it and what have you. I've now found that the drone label is limiting us. And so you'll see a switch in a lot of our language that we do now is more around aerial intelligence. My kind of push here is if it's data above the ground, I'm interested in it. And I say that because we'll start to use and we embed satellite imagery maps and conditional data sets across the board. Manned aircraft plays a role for what we do as well. And so we kind of more look at it from an ecosystem play to be like, there is a new perception and perspective that is coming from data from above looking down that I don't think has been provided to us as a society yet that we fully understand. And I think that is starting to transition. That fits into both of what you're saying in terms of the digital twin, build out a replica of a 3D model of the real environment that you're in and the changing conditions to the external facade, not the internal, but it can move that way. And similar to roads is like situational awareness when there's accidents, aerial perspectives provide greater flexibility of what you call command and control. So command and control, you can command a drone from this room anywhere in the world mentality. And so there's that kind of perception. In terms of tangibility about what would I do if I was kind of the starting point, and I think there's some really great people in this space. You don't have to be the entrepreneur. You don't have to be the first one. The first person often is like the worst person you want to be. Like if you're uncertain, go and follow someone else, learn from their mistakes, let them be the full person, and then you can take their scars and go start afresh. And I think of Dave LT, who's in the UTS startup community here, was probably, I think, my second or third employee at Batir and helped set up our partnership with UTS on campus with Batir. And I think there are people like that that are fundamental to the success of an organization. So just because you're not the first, you're not the entrepreneur, you're not the CEO, whatever that might be, you actually play a pivotal role in the success of organizations. And I think that shouldn't be missed in terms of the journey and the experience that you get doing that. If you're uncertain about what to do, I'd say similar, go and do something, but go and learn from someone. And if you don't know where to go employment-wise, to start having coffee with people in the space, like start a conversation.
So 3 really different businesses having impact in different ways, and I think 3 different perspectives on how you can personally get to that place. And I think it, again, just sort of shows the diversity and, again, the future power that smart sensing technologies are going to have. I want to open it up now for questions. Obviously, we do have an audience here in the room. We also have an audience on Zoom. My colleague is monitoring the Zoom chat, so if you have a question at home, please feel free to pop it into the chat or Q&A function. We'll start with those here in the room. Do you have questions for our panelists?
I have a question. This is a great talk. Thanks, guys. You know, Sebastian, you talked about kind of use cases and kind of like finding the problems. And you guys are relatively early movers in your industries. Do you have any advice or comments on kind of like how you tiptoed into working with your first customer, or how you kind of, you know, because a lot of it's change making, right? And like kind of getting people open enough to do something completely different, not to make some an incremental change. Did you pitch it in terms of an incremental change, or did you pitch it in terms of kind of this is a game changer?
So I'll just quickly repeat the question for people at home. So the question was about how you connected with your first customer and whether you pitched it to them as an incremental change or a game changer.
I can jump in here because I think this is quite an interesting topic. It's a great question. My first one is never tell them that you're their first customer. Australians hate dealing with startups. They like the idea of dealing with startups, but they like the idea of dealing with startups the size of Canva or Atlassian. At that point, they like you. Before that, you're high risk. There's additional factors that come with it. So generally, like there are tricks that you can do. Hopefully no customers are actually listening. But never, like from an accounting perspective, never start your invoicing with the invoice number 1. Just don't do it. Just start at 157. It doesn't matter from an accounting perspective. It simply does not matter. So like there are tricks around that. Don't do that. So I would almost go, never, like ideally don't refer to. I hate being deemed in the startup community. I think you kind of want to get out of that language. I think you want to be seen as a business, and you want the language around the business. You want to look like you have the policies and procedures. Ideally have them, but you know, you're building that out. Then when you get to 100 customers plus, then all of a sudden change your language. Then you go back.
Yeah.
Now I'm a startup. It's really messy. Like, you know, I loved it. Westpac hit their centennial kind of thing, and they're like, we're the largest startup in Australia. And I'm like, holy shit, I am doing something wrong here if that's the space that I'm dealing with. So I think there's a perception of language that you've got to put, don't get caught up in the startup community language of hanging around startup. Get in the language of your customer first and foremost, and be part of the startup community because you learn a lot from it and you share the scars, but learn the language of the customer first and de-risk yourself. That is first and foremost, de-risk yourself. And then you almost, in terms of that, we started selling to the innovation arm because we're drone technology and that's where everyone saw us. Innovation arms within businesses are not the core decision makers. So as quickly as possible, pivot out of that and sell to the operational side of the business. If you can sell to the operational side of the business, you've got scale opportunity. That would be my 2 cents.
I think on that, one of the most important skills I think in relation to this is the skill of active listening. So you have to ask yourself, are you waiting for your turn to speak, or are you actually listening to what the person is saying? And a good kind of anecdote for that is Compass originally started out by tracking cows. So our whole idea was we wanted to basically create a bounding box but for cows so that you didn't have to have fences. And it was only through talking to hundreds of people that we actually came across traffic engineers who were just like, hey, have you thought about applying this technology, not to cows, but to cars? And we were like, actually, that might be a really good idea. And so we kind of went down that road instead. And then we had those conversations with people in that industry. So I think, and it really just came down to actually listening to what people in the market want and making sure that what you're providing solves a genuine problem.
Just quickly, one point to add to that as well. Sebastian, you mentioned kind of make sure you have kind of the infrastructure in place to look like you're kind of more sophisticated than you might be. A big part of that in smart sensing obviously is data. So having your like data policies, you know, really considered and have, you know, so maybe like bigger people with bigger pants on, you know, helping you with that process.
My name's Shane Herbert, and I have been coaching some founders in companies from time to time. I just want to follow on perhaps Emily's response is the best segue in this. Smart sensing is so broad, and there are so many problems. I think a common mistake is that, or common challenge is that startup founders have got so many shiny things to chase after. How do you focus on the one that's going to be right for you?
So again, just to briefly repeat it for folks at home, smart sensing is such a wide, broad set of technologies, broad potential sets of impacts. How do you zero in on the right angle for you?
It's I guess we discussed it before when we were saying about the impact. It's you find something you're passionate about. So it's something that sparks your joy usually, or your need, or your fear, or your BIRDI maps. I think was started because our founders was saying, oh, maybe that's some health problems. They're saying maybe I'll go blind, and if I go blind, what's out there for me? There's not much, but there can be something. So this fear turned into a passion of, oh, actually, there's so much we can do, and hopefully her vision is fine now. But still, since this is a real problem that people are facing, so let's go with that. So it wasn't. I think it was really focused on, okay, this is something that have impact on people, and went with that.
I think what you're saying as well, just because you pick one option doesn't make all the other options wrong. Yeah. So being able to just pick something and focus on it. The Compass example, we're just like, okay, we're going to focus on traffic and all the things involved in traffic, and we want to be industry standard in traffic and front of mind, and that's kind of the goal. And in terms of, say, product development, because you can run into that problem as well. You kind of like, oh, I have this idea and this idea, we can have this feature and this feature, and it's really just coming back to like the core of it, and it's like, what's the most basic, crappiest thing that you can first deliver in the quickest amount of time that's going to deliver the most value that someone's still going to put money on the table for it.
That's the thing, you nailed it as well in terms of being able to listen. Like I think the pivot from cows into traffic is smart. It doesn't necessarily, I would look and go, I don't think there's not an application in that agriculture sector. It probably just isn't ready for what you're doing now, whereas the traffic is probably front and center, can commercialize faster. The same with Bindi Maps. Like I know you focus on blind people, and I'd say I've got pretty good vision, but I think that solution probably would have helped me finding this room in this building, like, and I would have, and so I think there's an element of, you've got to go to where you can, how quickly can you execute on the idea in that area as well. Like we look at it short-term wise, what can we do right now, but we are building for the long term. So we build to be industry agnostic, but we have solutions specifically in the insurance industry, specifically in mining and agriculture, and in asset management. They're the three verticals we hit, and even that is a lot. But we can apply it in other areas. We could do search and rescue, we could do sport, we could do, a range of other things. But for now, we don't have the resources, so we just got to go kind of double down where we're getting wins.
I think you guys are all in the data business, which creates a lot of privacy issues, which I want to talk to you about. I think the future is actually combining lots of different data sources together. So 1 + 1 = 3, and then there's access control or cybersecurity issues. But do you want to comment on how that could be in the future?
So the question was about how we might be able to combine a variety of data sources in the future to make the whole more than just the sum of its parts.
That's like the IoT part of it, right?
Yeah.
Look, it depends on what you're doing. So there's an element of, there's a move towards the open source data model a bit more, but not necessarily. In the commercial space, there's still a mentality of own the data. A lot of our customers will now only deal with this because we say, if you're paying us to do that capture, you own that data. That's not ours. And so they own that data, but we own the IP around the platform and the knowledge around what the drones are doing and bits and pieces. So the output is theirs from it. There's an element, though, that there's a different type of conversation that we're also having, which is more about the, in say, if I use specifically bushfire aspects. We do stuff in post-disaster, but there's an application in pre. There's an element of who pays for the data capture, and then if you pay for that data capture, can you make it open source? And then what we're trying to do is set up what's called a drone research portal, which has got some great traction at the moment, which will allow approved researchers access to that open source data set. And then what you're doing is trying to plug in other sets, or ideally the other one is we're not precious. You might not need our interface at all. In fact, you probably don't care about our interface. You probably just want the data set. So how do you create open APIs that people can plug into? But we don't have that yet for certain reasons. So I think there's a question on who's going to drive that. And I think my observation is the customer's driving that dialogue more so than you think. I think there's a desire for it, but the customer is going, we're going to our customers going, once you've had that data for 2 years, it's literally of no use to you whatsoever. Would you consider contributing that to a research community in some way? And then it just slowly, that mentality can slowly change. But it takes time. And is it a priority to do that? No, but I like that most businesses are pretty open to it once you get to that point. But the commercialization time has to pass. And ideally, that 2 years is too long. But yeah, it is happening.
Yeah, when I look at deep tech companies, technology is key. So it was discussed a bit earlier, but when I look at the three companies here, I asked the question, are there similar companies with similar technology? You mentioned you had IP in space, so that's a bit still. But therefore, when you look at a company in deep tech areas, if you look at where this technology, what IP, and where can it be applied, particularly if you want to scale up the world's result. So for someone,
yeah,
the purest one needs to be professional voice and comments, awareness of where that's going. But that's a huge one. In that space, technology choices are necessarily fine. So technology is key for the success of the project. You mentioned the rapid change of technology, the infrastructure space. Involved 6-7 years ago on a project in China using electronic sensors and fiber optic sensors together with the probe on monitoring. So towering one go. The electronic sensors can now require constant maintenance every 6 months, systems maintenance and recalibration. Fiber optic sensors from 6 years without. So even though one had higher upfront costs, research product, and the other was much cheaper, but over the long run, it's difficult to see where this sensitivity. So technology is key to the success against competition. So I'd like to understand more, what is the IP portfolio of how are you leveraging that?
So there's an initial counterpoint that although sort of building off of what Sebastian had said, that you don't necessarily want to lead with the technology part for your customers, but that technology does matter to the ultimate success of the businesses. And particularly, potentially, if you want to scale. So what is the IP behind your businesses and what does that look like? I think that, correct me if I did not get that right. Okay, it was close enough.
I mean, it's a tough question now. It's a really good one. I think in terms of Compass and how we operate, a lot of that is tied up in continuously moving and continuously using the data we have in different ways so that we don't kind of either get caught being a bit of a one-trick pony in some senses. Because if you stop, you die, basically, as a startup. It's like a shark. If you stop swimming, it dies. So that's, I think, kind of one of the ways that we combat that issue as well.
I'll challenge it a little bit as a theory. I don't think fundamentally a business is defined by its IP. I think great businesses come off the back of having a great product and design. So it's a combination, right? Like Canva is phenomenal, but I don't think there's much IP. I could be wrong, but it's a brilliant business.
And there's different views of that, but that's not my point. You mentioned their IP there. I think without IP, people better the company that has the IP.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and I agree with you. Are there similar businesses out there to what we do? Completely, yes. And I think in terms of our focus and market demographic, we look at where drone adoption is going to be rapidly picked up. One of the best leverages we have is what we call the distributed network of operators and how quickly we can engage with them and maintaining that community, because that gives us rapid deployment, gives us better rates for our enterprise customers. But the IP for us sits in being drone agnostic. So we don't own the hardware, but what we do is we run QA checks on the data that's uploaded into our platform about where it sits, what height it's flown at, the overlap. So when you're processing that data before you process it,
So where is the in the data process?
it's in the before you process it, it's almost in the QA of the data, the raw data that's coming into the platform, and the ability to tag that in certain ways. It's somewhat technical. Is it completely defensible? You know, like,
Because, for example, I think what's the company? Shark.
yeah, the shark spotter one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in that situation, I say for us in our model, it's right. Like the reason why we go, and I'm getting specific on us, but we look at drone adoption in 4 areas: capture, compliance, capture, data, and then the insights. And everyone's racing to insights about, hey, we can spot a shark, we can spot a dolphin. This is a person walking here. This person's 20 meters away from that person. All of that's brilliant. There's going to be amazing applications on AI and ML at that point in time. We don't specialize in that. We specialize in getting the data sets that then you can then apply that technology to. And so a lot of our partners, like we call them, like there's a certain partnership model that we have, we will be their distributed capture partner. So they can go to market with their IP on that thing, but they need our network to be able to offer a solution to their customer as well. And so we're a part of that data collection component as well. And that allows us to get insights on what applications we apply. So,
And you've got PCTs in the US.
no, not in the no.
I want to say also a few words on this, and I also want to challenge that. So I guess the question is, how are you competitive, right? That's how I understand it. How are you competitive? Why does, why can't someone else do the same thing? So in terms of IP, it's not that we have the something which is unique, secret. We do some things well in terms of indoor localization, which are better than most of the other similar companies around the world that do that for us. But what I think gives us an advantage is the way our business model operates. So what we do is useful if it is everywhere, right? If it is everywhere, like Google Maps, it would be very, very useful. If it is in 2 buildings, not really, right? Not so much. So far, I've seen some, the indoor localization, indoor navigation area is huge, and people want to get into it. And people have developed some solutions already, many years now. And for example, there are a couple of airports that have their own, indoor navigation systems where they are based on Wi-Fi, and you need to download the app. And there's them all. I've also done another pilot thing that they also have their own app to do that. The user is not going to, bother downloading an app to navigate in the mall or a single airport. So the idea is how do you get a lot of people, everyone using what you're building, right? It's interesting that the way we are, we started with focusing on blind people. We are offering this as an accessibility option. And this works amazingly well. People, building managers are saying, actually, this sounds like a very good idea. I can start investing in it. I can have it as a service in our mall, even though very few people will use it. And I know that from the beginning, right? Still, it's like I want to see what's happening. I want to see, and also it's good publicity for me, right? I can advertise that, I'm doing something like a social good. So with this thing, we put our foot in the door and have something in this mall, and then the next mall. So I find this is an excellent way to start building the business. And if you're becoming large enough, then this is your competitive advantage. It's not specifically technology, although technology is important. It's definitely important because you have to be efficient, you have to be cheap, and those are not easy problems to solve. And this is what I'm solving, that I'm a technologist. But from my point of view, understanding the business, I'm saying, although what I'm doing, the problems I'm solving are very important, the key is not the technology. The competitive advantage is not the technology. It's how the business model operates in our specific case. And I assume for most of the businesses, this is what works. This is what is in the advantage, not the specific technology, not the specific idea.
Someone can do that.
Why do they do it? Why do they do it?
So I'm gonna let us continue that after the panel. I know we are out of time. I also know we have 2 questions from online. So can you read me the questions from online? We'll see if we can combine them in any sort of interesting way as we wrap up here.
I think we've already answered one, which is
Great.
great.
Fantastic.
The other question was, how do we manage the balance of risk and error in the programming of sensor technology and the instruments?
Yeah. For us, well, we're not dealing with life and death situations. So we err on the side of errors. Make more errors doesn't matter. It's fine. So try and fail.
I think as well with data, there is an acceptable level of error, and that's just regardless of what industry you're in, have to kind of accept, and there is a wider industry acceptance that there is a certain percentage that is acceptable for most people to kind of take in.
Do you want to
Oh, mine's a slight variation almost, is we're in aviation. So aviation industry is not receptive to errors. And they have a very different stance, which is completely validated. And so there's an element of, it's a lot more transparent about when there's an issue, it's shared across the sector. And so we're very clear about it, and that we deal with a lot of operators, that we consolidate the feedback of when an error goes wrong, and that's appropriately reported to the ATSB, which is the Australian Transport Safety Bureau as well, and trying to work with that peak body, the regulator, to work out how does the industry adopt that aviation mandate. It's hard to do, but that's the industry we're in.